welcome back to Felony Spectator. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. It will help support me and my channel. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're telling the story of David Milagaard and his wrongful conviction in the murder of Gail Miller. David ended up spending 22 years in prison before he was released, and it wasn't until DNA testing was done in 1997 that finally completely exonerated him. And this totally isn't uncommon. There have been a lot of people who have been released from prison and completely exonerated of one of the crimes that they were accused of committing. There are lawyers who dedicate their entire careers to getting these types of people out of prison. The justice system has its flaws, and jurors aren't always the best at determining a reasonable doubt. Humans are very emotionally driven, and that could cloud our judgment. Anyway, let's get into this case. We'll start with Gail Miller. Gail Miller grew up in Laura, Saskatchewan, which is a small farming town with her 8 siblings. And this town was your typical small town. Not a lot for kids to do other than help out on the farm. And when kids grow up, they often just settle down and get married, taking over the family farm and never leaving. Gail, however, wanted more out of life, and staying in this small town just wasn't something that she saw herself doing. Gail's grandma would offer to pay for Gail to go to Saskatoon to study nursing, as this was always her dream. Gail was very excited and looked forward to helping children and babies most of all. Gail would rent a room in Saskatoon and enroll in a 1-year program at the Institute of Kelsey campus. The course was hard and really time-consuming, but she wasn't a partier and just really wanted to get a job helping kids being a nurse. Gail and some other students were sent to Swift Current Union Hospital for the practical portion of the program. She would live in residence with some other women, and just like at university, she hardly went out and focused most of her time on her studies. Her big outings were going to the grocery store. Gail would eventually get a job on the children's ward of the Saskatoon Hospital, and she was thrilled. Her dreams were coming true. Once she had enough money, she wanted to move out of her rental room and find somewhere better to live and closer to the hospital. Gail told a friend and co-worker, Vicki Lynn Fontaine, that she was actually really nervous taking the bus in the very early hours of the morning. It was also extremely cold that winter, and she really didn't like standing in the dark to catch the bus. Then the morning of January 31st, 1969, Vicki Lynn and Gail were to start work at 7:30 a.m. Gail unfortunately never showed up to that early morning shift. It was extremely cold that morning, and the weatherman had instructed anyone not to go outside and just to stay home that day. The temperature was around -40 Celsius, and a thick fog had rolled over into the city. School wasn't canceled though, and many kids still walked to school despite the risk of frostbite. Around 8:35 a.m., an 11-year-old would be walking to school when she stumbled upon a body face down in the snow. She also noticed that the snow around the body was trampled, and there was red spots all over the place. Sadly, this body would later be identified as Gail Miller. The police who came to the scene noticed that Gail had clearly been attacked. Her coat was unbuttoned, her white nurse's uniform was pulled up above her waist, and her white stockings had been pulled down. There was blood and cuts all over her throat and stomach. Sadly, she was only about a block away from her rooming home. Gail's friend, Vicki Lynn, had been called into the personnel office where detectives would ask Vicki many questions involving Gail, like who her boyfriend was or anybody who was close in contact with Gail. Unfortunately, everyone who met Gail all really liked her. She had no known enemies. She was pleasant, easy to get along with, and sometimes shy, but never rude. The town was obviously very heartbroken by this event. A young nursing student found dead in an alley. Some information that wasn't immediately released to the public was that 2 other women who lived in the same neighborhood were also sexually attacked just months before. Both of these women were attacked at knife point and both dragged into an alley. Thankfully, they survived their attacker. Unfortunately, with these reports, there wasn't much evidence either. The same morning that Gail was found, Linda Fisher heard the radio telling listeners that a woman's body had been found down an alley just 1.5 blocks from her home. She was really surprised by this because it was so close to where she lived. Also that morning, Linda Fisher and her husband Larry had been fighting because he was out all night gallivanting. Larry was a 19-year-old construction worker who often spent his evenings drinking at the bar. It wasn't uncommon for him to come home in the early hours of the morning, but this particular morning he failed to get up to go to work. And this was unlike him. Linda was mad and started a fight with him about his lack of responsibility because she felt he should go back to work no matter what. But instead, he was sitting around in the living room with his weekend clothing on. Linda and Larry lived in a basement apartment, and right above them were her landlords, the Caldrains. The Caldrains had 7 boys and 2 girls. One of the boys, Albert Henry Caldrain, aka Shorty, was awake early that morning as well. His longtime friend David Milagaard had come knocking. David Milagaard and his family moved to a small town in Winnipeg in the mid-60s. His parents, Joyce and Lauren, loved their 4 kids more than anything. David was someone who loved cars. He loved everything about cars, but he also loved the freedom of having a car. He loved adventure and being able to just get into his car, drive away, and experience the world. He was also known for being a little bit of a show-off. And this is mainly because he moved around a lot as a kid, and it could have been his way of fitting in. But this would be a problem, especially when it involved David doing dumb and impulsive things. His poor choices resulted in his parents becoming worried that there could be something wrong with David, and they admitted him to a psychiatric center in Yorktown, Saskatchewan. The doctor there determined that there was actually nothing wrong with David. He had no signs of psychotic behavior, wasn't overly violent or sexual. They said he was just a regular kid who perhaps was just a little rebellious. In the summer of '68, when David was only 16, David knew he had a gift for talking and applied for a sales license job so he could sell magazine subscriptions. But this license took a long time to get approved. David would start to get impatient, and by the end of summer, David and his friend Ron decided to go on a road trip in Ron's new car, a '58 Pontiac. They'd also asked their friend Nicole, and Nicole had just quit her waitressing job and dropped out of school, so she had nothing better to do. And a side note, Nicole and David were also friends with benefits, you could say. Lastly, David wanted to find his friend Shorty and ask him if he wanted to go on a road trip with them. Ron and Nicole didn't have an issue with that, so they set out first to find Shorty's house in Saskatoon, which they didn't have an address for. The group had some issues leaving Regina, Saskatchewan because the car had flat tires. They also needed to get license plates, and the car wouldn't start because the battery was dead. The 3 of them also didn't have any money, so David and Ron would steal a battery and ended up getting holes in their clothes from spilling battery acid on themselves. When they did finally leave town, it was about 12:30 a.m. on January 31st. Their first stop was to go and pick up David's friend, Shorty. They arrived in Saskatoon, where Shorty lived, at about 5:30 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. the following morning. David couldn't remember where Shorty lived. He knew it was beside a church, but that's about it. So they drove around the city for a while and at one point stopped to ask a woman for directions who was walking down the road. This woman wasn't able to help, so they just continued to drive looking for a church. They would also stop at a Travelier motel, and David would ask the manager for directions. The manager remembers David being kind and courteous. He gave him a map, but also noticed that David wasn't wearing any shoes and had entered wearing only his socks. And this is important because it shows that the manager took note of what David was wearing and didn't notice any blood or anything else strange about what he was wearing. David would later say that his feet were hot from the car's heater and he just ran through the snow to cool them off. David got back in the car, drove around some more, but they were still unable to find Shorty's house. Then they would come across a man whose car was stuck in the snow, and it would be David that convinced his friends that they should stop and help this man. Ron didn't really want to because he was worried his car would get stuck as well, but David was very convincing, and they did end up stopping. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful in getting this man's car unstuck, And sure enough, Ron's car would also get stuck in the snow. Walter, the man who they tried to help, offered the group to come inside his home and wait for a tow truck. Walter said David was polite and had told him about their planned road trip to Edmonton. The only thing he noticed was that David's pants were ripped, but other than that, everyone seemed normal. David and his friends did eventually find Shorty's house. It was across the street from St. Mary's Church on 20th Street and Zero Ave, which also happened to be only 1.5 blocks from where Gail would be located. And in the basement of the house was the apartment where Linda and Larry lived. It was also around 9 a.m. at this point, so Gail's body would have already been discovered, police were already investigating, and the radio would be broadcasting the discovery. Linda and Larry were probably fighting about Larry missing work. While at Shorty's, David and Ron changed out of their pants that had all the acid holes in them, and the four of them discussed their road trip. None of them were listening to the radio, and none of them had any idea that a murder investigation was happening just down the road. Shorty had wanted his girlfriend and some other friends to come along too, so the group would spend most of the day finding these people who ended up declining. So Ron, David, Nicole, and Shorty would set out on the road around 4:30 p.m. The group did make it to Alberta, but ended up coming back around February 5th because they just had no money and no real plan. Not long after they returned, Shorty would be arrested with vagrancy and put in jail for a week. Now, while he was detained, investigators realized that he lived not far from the crime scene, so they dragged Shorty in for questioning regarding the murder of Gail Miller. They apparently started hammering him with all sorts of questions and wanted to know why he was in such a hurry to leave town that morning. At the time, Shorty said he hadn't even known of the murder and probably just told the real truth. Police let him go, but they threatened that he might end up dead in an alley if he continued to walk the streets. Strangely, 2 weeks later, Shorty voluntarily wanted to speak with authorities again and said that he had in fact seen David Milgaard at 9 a.m. that morning of the murder with blood on his clothes. Shorty went on to say that same day, David had disposed of a woman's cosmetic case. Shorty coming forward with this new information also meant that he would later collect $2,000 in reward money. Why did Shorty come back 2 weeks later? Apparently, everything started to come back to him in pieces. He first remembered the blood, and then he remembered David was acting strangely. He claims David also told Shorty during their trip that he was a member of the mafia, and David had suggested that they needed to wipe out Nicole and Ron because they, quote, knew too much. Police would need to interview the others. Ron was called in first. Ron spoke of the road trip, the car battery situation, driving around looking for Shorty's house, getting stuck and meeting Walter, and then arriving at Shorty's around 9. When asked if David was ever out of his sight, Ron said no. Not for more than a few minutes here or there, to go to the bathroom maybe, but for the most part, they were together. Nicole was also called in, and her story basically matched Ron's story. She was asked to join the road trip and had nothing better to do, so she went. She was basically in the car the entire time, and neither of them knew Gail's murder and seemed surprised to learn. By this time, David had since moved to Winnipeg to pursue that magazine sales job as his sales license finally got approved. When he was questioned, he too was surprised to learn about the murder. And again, his story was nearly identical to Ron and Nicole's. David even allowed the police to go through his motel room where absolutely nothing was found to incriminate him. The case was starting to go cold until an 8-year-old friend of one of Shorty's siblings was walking to their home down Zero Avenue. He would knock on Shorty's door to ask if his brother would come outside, but nobody was home, so he would go to another friend's house, kicking the snow as he went. As he was doing this, he would uncover a wallet just 3 doors down from Shorty's home. This wallet belonged to Gail Miller. Police would go door to door to ask if any of the residents saw anything suspicious that night, and another neighbor said that she had picked up a blue toque with blood on it. For some reason, she had just tossed it in her backyard, but she would retrieve it for the police. Police believed this was further proof that David had something more to this because he was at Shorty's house and these items all were found nearby. They didn't even question if David was wearing a toque at all that morning, nor did they think that possibly someone else did it who was living in the vicinity. Like Larry Fisher, who rented the basement apartment. Larry Fisher and Linda had married as teenagers when Linda became pregnant with Larry's baby. When they were dating, Larry was very romantic and they got along really well. But as soon as they got married and moved in together, he began drinking almost every day and sometimes never coming home. Larry also wasn't happy to be a dad. Linda thinks it's because he wanted a boy and they had a girl. Larry was so bitter and angry that he eventually started physically abusing Linda too. One time he kicked her in the head while they were visiting her aunt. Linda was sick of Larry and wanted to leave him. She went as far as to pack a bag and wanted to move in with her family until they got into that heated argument the morning of the murder. Linda had been unable to find their paring knife that morning and used that as an insult during their fight, saying to Larry, "You probably took that knife and went and killed that girl with it." And Larry's reaction was shocking to Linda, which was very scary for her. Surprisingly, he wasn't angry, he didn't lash out at her, and was actually quiet. She remembers that it seemed as though all the blood had drained from his face. And Linda didn't think he actually killed Gail, she was just trying to insult him, but she'd never forget that reaction he had. What Linda didn't know was that Larry was a serial rapist. His MO was to use a knife and threaten the women he raped. Larry would attack women who were alone, walking, or sometimes getting off the bus, and he'd attack them, threatening to kill them if they didn't do what he said. Police had issued a warning to women not to walk alone because they didn't know who this person was. The victims all complied to Larry's threats and were let go after the assault. Even though some suspected that the serial rapist could be responsible for Gail's murder because the attacks were strikingly similar, the police didn't dig further into that theory. Instead, police had their blinders on and zeroed in on David. They would start to basically harass Ron first because they needed another witness to back up Shorty's statement. So by bringing Ron in for questioning over and over, they were hoping to slowly break him down. Oftentimes, they tried to make it seem like Ron was the murderer and they were going to get him on charges just to scare him. Some of these interviews lasted upwards of 6 hours. Ron would leave feeling confused and tired and scared that he was going to be pinned for the murder. Police showed him Gail's blood-stained clothes, the paring knife that was used, and other crime scene photos that were really traumatizing to him. He was only 17. Ron was stressed out and was at the point that he would do just about anything to end the constant interrogations. It said he also became a drug addict during this time just to deal with all the stress. Police did similar interviews with Nicole. She was scared of everything that was going on and mentally not able to handle what the police were putting her through. Ron and Nicole both had learned information about the case that the public didn't know, and eventually used that information when agreeing with police the story that was incriminating David. Ron had cracked first. His version had them driving around looking for Shorty's house, and they saw the woman in the black coat walking down the road. David rolled down the window to ask for directions, and she wasn't helpful, and this made David angry. Ron then drove a few blocks and tried to pull a U-turn but got stuck. David and Ron tried to push the car out, but they couldn't. They needed to go get help, so David would start walking one way and Ron searched the other way. Ron was unsuccessful in finding anyone, so around 6:30 a.m. he went back to the car where Nicole was inside hysterical. A few minutes later, David came back saying, quote, "I fixed her," end quote. Other things that changed in his story was that he did in fact see blood on David's clothes before they changed at Shorty's, and that David was acting differently. Not long after Ron's confession, Nicole cracked too, and her final statement was that she saw the paring knife David used, and she saw him throw a cosmetic bag out the car window. Nicole would later say that she was on LSD for most of the entire year and doesn't actually remember much, but she hated being harassed. When she realized all she had to do was agree to what Shorty had told police, she did. Unfortunately, she also added that she was afraid of David. She implied that he would often coerce her into having sex with him, even though she didn't really want to, which made him sound really rapey. Whether that's true or not doesn't look good for David. Nicole's version of events largely matched what Ron had said, except that Nicole said she waited in the car when David and Ron walked off to get help. Where the car was stuck was right beside an alley, and she claims she could see David down the alley with the woman in the black coat. She then saw David reach with his right hand for his knife and stab the woman. And things get fuzzy here. She might have run away towards Ron, but she's not sure. The next thing she remembers, she's in the back of the car crying uncontrollably as they drive away. The problem with Nicole's statement is that David was left-handed. The chances of him using his right hand to pull the knife out were pretty slim. This information wouldn't be made public until after the trial years later. After the statements from Ron and Nicole were signed, David was arrested, and the media really ate this up. But anyone who knew David seemed very surprised, especially his family. The only other evidence the police had were some semen samples. The area where Gail was found was taped off for a while so police could melt the snow and try and find anything that could help them. 4 days into the investigation, police did locate 2 lumps of yellowish snow, later analyzed and found to be semen. Even though it wasn't found until 4 days after Gail was found, police didn't question that it could possibly have been compromised. Later, during the trial, lawyers tried to point out discrepancies like the semen sample. In the semen sample, the lab found blood antigens from someone with type A blood. David had type A, but David is part of 20% of the population that doesn't secrete blood antigens in his bodily fluids. The Crown convinced the jury that he must have secreted blood at some time, possibly from a cut or an STD, except David wasn't injured. He was healthy and free of any diseases, but that wasn't enough to convince the jury. During the trial, Shorty also made every effort to make David look like a dangerous person, repeating the story of David working for the mafia, and he added that at one point, David had stopped a transport truck while they were on the side of the road. When the truck pulled over, David handed him a suspicious-looking suitcase. And the jury must have believed these wild accusations because the main points of the story largely resembled Ron and Nicole's. David was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 35 years. 35 years is a sentence Canada doesn't even give out anymore. After David was in jail, the rapes in Shorty's and Larry's neighborhood continued. 3 more victims came forward saying that they were abused. One of his victims had gotten off the same bus that Gail used to take home and was attacked by a man who dragged her into a secluded yard. He hit her in the face and told her to be quiet or he'd snap her neck. He then raped her and quickly ran away. And police were stumped because the attacks all resembled the attack on Gail, but the man responsible for Gail's murder was already behind bars. And these women also survived, so it must have just been someone else. The rapes did temporarily stop because Larry ended up moving away to Winnipeg for a job. Linda stayed home in Saskatoon, so he moved in with some roommates. Larry's roommates in Winnipeg would later remember that Larry loved to drink and go out and party. He also enjoyed being alone and would leave the house late at night. Coincidentally, attacks on women in Winnipeg would start while Larry was living there with the same MO. They were all dragged into an alley or vacant property like a field and were all held at knife point. While in Winnipeg, Larry had attacked Mary Pearson just after 1 a.m. While he was dragging Mary off the sidewalk, he dropped his paring knife and Mary screamed loud enough to alert neighbors. Someone would call the police and Larry would be arrested. Larry actually admitted to 6 attacks, which included 4 in Saskatoon. Unfortunately, Gail's murder wasn't one he admitted to. So Larry served a 10-year sentence for these crimes and was later released in 1980. Meanwhile, David wasn't doing well in prison. He was often alone, often rambling to himself, and would be sent to the prison psychiatrist who never found anything wrong with him and would just send him back to general population. There was a few suicide attempts too, one where David tried to jump out a window, another when he tried to swallow copper wire, and he also tried to slit his wrist. But nobody thought it was because life in prison was affecting his mental health, especially an innocent man in prison. And to make matters worse for himself, David also escaped from prison. One time in March of 1980 and another time in August of 1980. The second time, he was granted a temporary leave of absence to attend his brother's birthday. While at the barbecue, he was left alone for no less than 5 minutes, and he took that opportunity and ran. David managed to travel all the way to downtown Toronto and gave himself the name David McAdam and got a job. He rented an apartment and tried to live life like a regular member of society. Then on November 8th, David was finally identified and arrested after being shot in the bum when police were incorrectly told that he was armed and dangerous. David wasn't armed and there was no weapons in his apartment. He truly just wanted to live life as an innocent man outside of prison. Throughout David's entire incarceration, his mother never gave up on him. She knew in her soul that David was innocent. She agreed that David was a free spirit and had done drugs and could be manipulative. But he was no killer. She took out $10,000 from her retirement savings to offer as a reward to find the real killer of Gail Miller, and worked her butt off investigating every aspect of this case. With the help of a freelance journalist, they would track down Ron and Nicole and try and discuss their testimonies to get the truth. During the time Larry got out of prison after serving his 10-year sentence, he went back home to North Battleford, Saskatchewan, and committed another attack on a 56-year-old woman who was walking home late at night. Like his other victims, he dragged her out of sight and held a knife to her throat and raped her. This time, he also slit her throat, stabbed her in the chest before attempting to suffocate her. Miraculously, she lived. After Larry fled, she managed to drag herself to the back door of a nearby neighbor's home for help. Being that Larry was freshly released, police immediately checked on Larry and caught him in his mother's house, washing blood off his boots. Larry would then get a new 10-year sentence for the attempted murder and rape of his latest victim. Media would start to get more and more interested in David's case, and there were several programs that showcased David because things just didn't add up. Like, how could he have raped a woman in minus 40-degree weather in deep snow without being covered in snow or wet? There was also the time frame in which David had, which seemed really short. If he was only out of sight for 5 minutes, or even 15 if we're being generous, how did he go find the woman in the black coat, rape her, stab her, dump her purse, take her cosmetic bag, get dressed, and come back all in that time? Then they went to Walter's house. Remember, they pulled over to help Walter out and he invited them into his home? He didn't notice wet clothes or blood or anything. He thought the group were all acting normal. David tried to appeal his sentence every chance he could and also tried to apply for parole as well, but his catch-22 was that he denied the offense. In the parole board's eyes, if you can't admit what you've done and you're not remorseful, then you're not ready to be released. Even after the fact that David proved he could be a productive member of society when he escaped, it didn't matter. Then one day while in his cell, David watched a documentary on DNA analysis. He contacted his lawyers to see if they could test his DNA against any evidence that was left at the old crime scene. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough DNA left on Gail's clothes, and it was too hard to say if any of the DNA that was there would be unaltered or contaminated. So the judge denied his request. David's lawyers tried to argue that David didn't secrete antigens in his semen, so any blood found in the yellow lumps of snow couldn't have come from David. They also argued that those yellow lumps of snow were collected 4 days after Gail was found, after police trampled through the snow. Lastly, back in 1969, when the samples were first taken, testing was so inadequate that they couldn't tell the difference between A or AB blood. So there was no solid proof that any of the samples were even David's. It wouldn't be until 1991 when David's mother got the truth out of Nicole and Ron and persisted to try and get David out, did the Supreme Court finally order a new trial. The trial never actually happened, though. The judge ruled that there was enough reasonable doubt that David shouldn't have been convicted in the first place, and he decided to release David instead of going through a whole new trial. David's lawyers also presented new evidence that showed Larry Fisher could be responsible for Gail Williams' murder, mainly pointing out that he was responsible for other attacks on women in the neighborhood where Gail lived. Now that David was released, he pushed one last time for the DNA evidence to be tested. He just really wanted to clear his name and really thought he had nothing else to lose. So in May of 1997, the courts finally agreed, and they also ran the tests against Ron, as well as someone who had previously dated Gail, as well as Larry Fisher. Sure enough, the tests came back showing that it was not David's semen and he would be completely exonerated. David said learning that was one of the happiest days of his life, second to the birth of his twins. He got to prove to the world that he wasn't a killer. This DNA evidence also led to the conviction of Larry Fisher for the murder of Gail Miller. Finally, David would receive a letter of apology from the Saskatchewan government and $10 million. Even though David was exonerated, he suffered while in prison. Assaulted physically and sexually on numerous occasions. He tried to commit suicide several times and fell into a really deep depression. He was not well at all while in prison. Sometimes in Canada, we joke that our prisoners have it easy, but it really isn't true, especially when you're innocent of the crimes you're accused of, and that's gotta really be tough mentally. David was emotionally damaged after he was released, and his mother later said it took him a really long time to trust people again. David did go on to get married and have 2 children, but it was in helping others that he really felt human again. He didn't hold a grudge, and he just wanted to live life to the fullest with the time that he had. David's lawyer, who had become good friends with David, had said that he was a very caring, loving, and gentle person. David unfortunately passed away this past May of 2022 at the age of 69 to pneumonia. My thoughts? This case is so sad. David's life was forever changed because police were pressured to solve this murder quickly and to have someone behind bars. And I appreciate that there is urgency to solve a crime like Gail's murder, get the bad guy off the street, get closure for the family, give the community a sense of relief, but it just meant that he had to spend 22 years behind prison. Often when things aren't done quickly, people also get angry about that too. Right now where I live, a woman by the name of Trina Hunt was murdered, and the family and public just want justice. And all you hear is, why is it taking so long? Why hasn't there been an arrest? With that said, rushing justice is not a good option, especially when it involves police terrorizing witnesses into confessing things that never happened. Not only was David's life ruined, but so was his friends Ron and Nicole, and even Shorty. They had to live with being harassed, tormented, going to court, and convicting their friend who they knew deep down was innocent. They suffered too. Now, I could be wrong, but could this be what's happening with Adnan Syed? Police will interview over and over, feeding bits of information and theories, as well as making threats and using scare tactics until they have what they need. False confessions happen all the time. So did Jay get sucked into that with Adnan? The fact that witness statements in both cases consistently changed, to me, is huge red flags. For David, he was monetarily compensated and did go on to living a normal life, but so many years in prison surely ruined pieces of him. Larry Fisher was also not held accountable for 22 years and continued to abuse women over and over. What do you think of the errors made in this case? Did David get compensated fairly? What are your thoughts? I would love to know. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator, and we will see you again soon.